Nobody in the village ever heard Thomas raise his voice. Not when the crops failed. Not when his wife passed away. And certainly not when the bank came knocking on his door. But that morning, the scream he let out shook the still air across the fields. Thomas had been walking the narrow trail behind his barn, same as always, heading toward the edge of the forest where his orchard met the wild. His boots crunched on dry leaves, the wind soft in the trees. But something didn't feel right. The birds weren't singing. He paused, looked up, and there, hanging by a thin, frayed rope from a crooked old tree, were two tiny, lifeless bodies. Puppies. Their legs dangled in the air, eyes closed. Still, Thomas stumbled back, heart pounding. For a moment the world tilted, and he could barely breathe. He wasn't just looking at two animals. He was looking at something he had seen before. Years ago, a different kind of loss, a different kind of silence. And then one of the puppies twitched. It was barely a flicker, a soft gasp for air. But it was enough. Thomas tore through the branches, climbed the uneven roots, and with trembling hands he loosened the rope. Both puppies dropped into his arms. So light, so broken, so warm. He didn't think. He just ran. Down the path, through the field, back to the small farmhouse that had known too much sorrow. And as he placed the two fragile pups on a pile of his late wife's old quilts, something in him cracked open. He didn't even know their names. Didn't know who could do such a thing. Didn't know if they'd survive the night. But he knew he couldn't lose them too. Not again. And as he sat beside them, whispering the same lullabies he once sang to his daughter, the sun began to rise. That was the moment the village changed. But before we get to what happened next, before we uncover the story that would bring strangers to tears and neighbors to their knees, let me take you back. Back to the man Thomas used to be. The man who had already lost everything, long before those puppies ever appeared. Years before that morning, Thomas Langley had a very different life. His laughter used to echo through that same orchard. His daughter, Ellie, would chase fireflies barefoot through the rows of apple trees while his wife, Marianne, baked pies with the windows wide open, letting in the smell of cinnamon and soil. They were a small family, but they had enough. Enough love, enough laughter, enough hope. Until the night the fever came. It started with Ellie's cough. A soft one, nothing more than a whisper. By morning she couldn't stand. By nightfall the silence had returned. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that lingers after a goodbye you never got to say. 3 weeks later, Marianne was gone too. They said it was grief, that her heart just gave up. And Thomas, the man who once lit candles for dinner even on weekdays, stopped lighting anything at all. The only flame he kept alive was the one on the oil lantern near their graves. He never left the village, never remarried, never opened the windows again. But there was one thing he still did. Every morning before dawn, he walked the same path behind the barn. It was his way of saying, "I'm still here, even if no one else was listening." Then came the morning of the tree, the morning that pulled him out of memory and back into pain. The puppies were barely clinging to life. He named the stronger one Maple, after the tree he cut to build Ellie's crib. The weaker one he called Willow, gentle, fragile, bending with the wind. They were both covered in cuts, their legs stiff from hanging, and their breathing uneven. But in their eyes, there was no hatred, just fear, and something even softer, trust. For days, Thomas didn't sleep. He fed them with droppers, wrapped them in warm towels, and whispered their names like prayer. It was during one of those nights, when the wind outside howled like a ghost and the pups whimpered in their sleep, that he looked up and said softly, "Who could do this? And why did the world choose me to find them?" And maybe it was because he knew what it was like to be left behind, to be barely holding on, to be waiting for someone to say, "You're still worth saving." And you watching this from wherever in the world you are, maybe you understand that kind of silence too. Maybe you've lost something, or someone, or even yourself. So pause for a moment and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. Not because it helps the algorithm, but because stories like this remind us that kindness is bigger than borders, that love can be shared between strangers, And if this story has touched even a corner of your heart, stay with us. Like this video, subscribe, not for numbers, but for the reminder that in a world this broken, compassion still echoes. Back in Thomas's farmhouse, the turning point came on the fourth night. Willow stopped breathing. He heard the gasp from across the room and ran to her, heart in his throat. She was cold, her body limp, her mouth barely moving. He thought it was over. But then Maple, the stronger one, crawled toward her. Slow, struggling, every step like dragging a mountain. She curled up beside her sister, rested her tiny head on Willow's chest, and stayed still. For hours. And just before dawn, Willow's chest moved. A small breath, then another. That morning, Thomas cried like he hadn't cried in 10 years. Not because he was sad, but because for the first time in forever, he believed again. In life, in second chances, and in the idea that maybe, just maybe, he hadn't been forgotten. Not by the world, not by his wife and daughter, and not by the two little souls who had come into his life when he needed them most. By the seventh day, both puppies were walking again. Not perfectly, not steadily, but every small, wobbly step was a miracle in motion. Thomas had turned the old guest room, once filled with dust and silence, into a little nursery. He lined the floor with quilts and placed bowls of soft food in the corner. And every evening, he'd sit on the floor with them, knees creaking, heart wide open, telling stories he hadn't told in years. But still, something didn't sit right. Someone had done this. Someone had hung those puppies from that tree. And no one in the village had come forward. No footprints, no note, no rumors, just silence. Until one cold morning, as the first frost laced the windows, Thomas heard the creak of his gate. He peeked through the curtains and saw a boy, no older than 12, standing by the fence with a slingshot in his back pocket and a bruise on his cheek. The boy didn't knock, didn't speak. He just stood there, eyes darting toward the window, then to the barn, then back to the dirt road like he was waiting for something or someone to stop him. Thomas opened the door and stepped outside. "You lost?" he asked, keeping his voice gentle. The boy looked up. His eyes were sharp, too sharp for someone that young. "No," the boy said, stuffing his hands in his coat. "I just heard you had dogs." Thomas nodded slowly. "They're not dogs," he said. "They're family." The boy flinched. Not in fear, almost like the word family hit a wound too deep to speak of. Can I see them?" the boy asked. Thomas didn't answer right away. He studied the boy. Thin frame, torn sleeves, and something else, shame hiding behind pride. "What's your name?" Thomas finally asked. "Liam." "All right, Liam, but you only stay 5 minutes. They're still healing." Liam followed him inside, eyes wide as he stepped into the warm living room. The smell of stew filled the air, and a fire cracked softly in the corner. It was probably the warmest place Liam had stood in all year. As they walked into the guest room, the puppies perked up. Maple ran to Thomas's feet, tail wagging. Willow stayed curled up, blinking sleepily. Liam dropped to his knees. "They're alive," he whispered. "I thought." He didn't finish his sentence. His voice trembled. Thomas placed a hand on his shoulder. "Did you see what happened to them?" he asked. Liam shook his head. "No, but his breath caught. I didn't stop it either." Silence filled the room like fog. Liam stared at the floor, his face pale. "My brother, he gets angry sometimes. Says animals are useless. Said if I told anyone, he'd hang me next." Thomas felt a slow burn rise in his chest, but he kept his voice calm. "And yet you came here. I heard about what you did. I thought you'd hate me, or yell, or call the sheriff." Thomas didn't yell. He didn't call anyone. He just nodded, crouched beside him, and said, "We all carry things, Liam. The weight isn't the problem. It's how long we carry it alone." Liam broke down, right there in that tiny room, the same room where Willow had taken her first full breath. Stories like this remind us that no matter where we are, we feel the same pain and the same hope. Comment your country below. And if this moment touched you, hit like and subscribe, because kindness deserves to be passed on. He cried for the puppies, for his mother, who worked nights and didn't ask questions, for his brother, whose rage was a fire no one had put out, and maybe for himself. That day, Thomas made a decision. He didn't just want to save the puppies. He wanted to build something bigger than revenge, bigger than pain. He wanted to start again. And oddly enough, Liam never left. He began visiting every weekend, feeding the dogs, cleaning the barn, asking questions about apples and planting seasons and how to tell when the weather was about to change. And each time he came, he smiled a little more. Maple and Willow grew stronger too. They played in the yard, chased leaves, and curled up beside the fireplace at night. They trusted Liam, because they saw something in him Thomas had nearly missed, the kind of heart that knew what it meant to be helpless, and chose not to let others feel that way. Then, one afternoon, a woman from the next town over knocked on Thomas's door. She wore thick glasses and held a clipboard. "We heard about the rescue," she said. "The story made it to a community forum. People are calling it the miracle at Maple Hill." Thomas chuckled. "Miracle, huh?" She nodded. "There's more. We've had over 30 people reach out, wanting to donate, volunteer, adopt, even build a proper shelter nearby." Thomas blinked. "You mean a rescue center?" "Yes, but only if you're willing to lead it." He didn't answer right away. He looked out the window, where Liam was throwing a stick and both puppies were chasing it, ears flapping like tiny sails in the wind. "I think," Thomas finally said, "we're already building it," because the truth was the rescue didn't start with the puppies. It started with one broken man, one frightened boy, and two little souls hanging from a tree, refusing to give up. Winter came early that year. Snow blanketed the orchard in silence, the same kind of silence Thomas used to fear. But now it felt different, softer, like the world had slowed down just enough to let healing take root. Maple and Willow had grown fast. Their fur thickened, their legs grew strong, and their barks had found rhythm. They were no longer just survivors, they were protectors, watchers, companions. One evening, just before the sun dipped below the treetops, Thomas stood by the fireplace holding an old photograph. Ellie with braids, sitting on her favorite quilt, a smile too wide for her face. He hadn't looked at that photo in nearly a decade. He placed it on the mantel and whispered, "They would have loved you." Liam was in the kitchen stirring soup. The dogs sprawled across the rug beside him. It had become their new rhythm. Quiet dinners, warm rooms, and stories shared like gifts no one had ever dared open before. But that peace was tested sooner than they expected. It happened on a Friday. Thomas had driven into town to pick up feed and supplies. When he returned, the front gate was open, the door ajar, and inside chaos. The house was ransacked, papers scattered, drawers overturned, and Liam gone. Maple was pacing, her paw bleeding. Willow was hiding under the table, trembling. Thomas's heart dropped. He ran room to room, calling Liam's name, but there was only silence. Again. Then he saw it. A message carved into the wood of the front door. Should have stayed out of it. Thomas knew exactly who had done it. Liam's brother. Without wasting a second, he packed a flashlight, a blanket, and some biscuits, then set out with the dogs into the freezing night. He knew where to go. Liam once mentioned an abandoned barn near the ridge, a place his brother would hide when things got too loud at home. The wind howled through the trees as they climbed, the flashlight beam cutting through the dark like a blade. And then, deep in the woods, a whimper. Maple growled low. Willow sprinted forward, leading the way. Inside the barn, curled up behind a pile of rotting hay, was Liam, shivering, lips blue, his cheeks swollen fresh. Thomas rushed to him, dropping the blanket around his shoulders. "I didn't tell him," Liam whispered. "I swear." But he found out anyway. Thomas didn't ask how, didn't need to. He just held the boy close, his voice shaking. "You're safe now, I promise." For the first time since Ellie died, Thomas felt that same fire inside him. Not the fire of anger, but the one that rises when you know you're protecting someone who matters more than anything. They stayed the night in that barn, huddled close with the dogs curled around them, body heat and kindness keeping the cold at bay. By morning, the village was waiting. Word had spread again. But this time, it wasn't just about puppies. It was about a boy, a farmer, and the kind of love that refuses to let go. People from all over came to help rebuild. Volunteers offered supplies, security, even therapy. And slowly, the shelter took shape. Wooden beams lifted by hands that once only waved hello, now gripping hammers for a cause. The grand opening of Maple Hill Rescue Center happened in spring. Kids from nearby schools visited. Families came to adopt. And on one special day, a woman walked in carrying a newborn puppy wrapped in a scarf. "He was left outside a store," she said. "No note, just cold." Liam stepped forward, Maple and Willow at his side. "We'll take care of him." Thomas watched from the doorway, pride swelling like a sunrise in his chest. The boy who once trembled in silence now stood tall, speaking for the voiceless, not with fear, but with purpose. Later that evening, as the sky turned pink and golden over the fields, Thomas sat with Liam on the old porch swing. The dogs rested between them. "Why did you do it?" Liam asked quietly. "Why didn't you give up, even when it hurt?" Thomas smiled. "Because someone once told me, if you carry something heavy long enough, it can bury you. But if you share it, if you let others hold a piece of it, it becomes something else." "What?" "A bridge." Liam looked out over the orchard. "Do you think we saved them?" he asked. Thomas nodded slowly. "I think they saved us first." And in that moment, with the wind gently passing through the apple blossoms, it was clear. The reunion wasn't just between man and dog, but between grief and grace, between the past and the future, between two souls who had once been lost and finally found each other. Healing is never a straight road. It wins, it stumbles, it tests your will when you think you've given all you can. Even after the rescue center opened, Thomas and Liam faced more than just memories. Maple developed an infection in her leg, a nasty one that left her limping for weeks, unable to play or even stand some days. Willow, sensing her sister's pain, grew anxious, barking at shadows, pacing at night. The trauma still lingered, deep, quiet, alive. Thomas would stay up late rubbing balm into Maple's fur, whispering that it would pass, just like he used to do for Ellie during stormy nights. Liam sat beside Willow, holding her close, telling her she was safe now, even if sometimes he didn't feel so safe himself. One afternoon, Liam was helping load supplies when he froze at the sight of a car pulling into the lot. It was his brother's. The man didn't get out, just stared from the window, a smirk, a glare, and then he drove off. Liam didn't speak for 2 days. Thomas gave him space but never let him feel alone. He didn't need to ask what that kind of fear felt like. He knew. Fear of things returning, of peace being taken, of never truly being free. But it was during this silence that something extraordinary happened. A young girl came to the shelter with her mother. Her name was Rosie, and she had trouble speaking after an accident that left her voice weak and uncertain. She sat quietly in the corner, watching the dogs, never reaching out, until Maple limped over and lay her head gently in Rosie's lap. Rosie smiled, for the first time in months. Then, soft as a whisper, she said, "She's like me." Everyone in the room went still, because in that moment healing became visible. It wasn't fast, it wasn't loud, but it was real. Rosie came back every week. So did others. Kids who had been bullied, teens who had lost parents, elders with eyes full of stories and hands too tired to write them anymore. The rescue wasn't just for dogs anymore. It became a place where the broken didn't have to hide. And with every new story, every soft bark, every hug shared between child and pup, Liam began to rise. Bit by bit, day by day, he spoke at community events, helped train new volunteers, even started writing a journal called Things I Thought I'd Never Survive, because surviving wasn't enough anymore. He wanted to live. And as for Thomas, he found himself planting again. Apples, wildflowers, hope. The challenges didn't vanish, but they stopped being walls. They became steps, each one carrying them, man, boy, and dogs, toward something stronger than survival, toward a life remade in kindness, brick by brick, paw by paw. The following spring, the orchard bloomed brighter than ever. It wasn't just the flowers. It was the laughter that echoed through the fields, the tiny feet of schoolchildren racing between the trees, the scent of apple pie drifting from the kitchen again, this time baked by Liam, proudly using Marianne's old recipe book with sticky fingers and a determined smile. And Thomas? He was no longer the lonely man in the farmhouse. He had become something more: caretaker, a teacher, a grandfather in spirit, if not in name. On the 1-year anniversary of the rescue, the village gathered. The mayor gave a short speech. Volunteers shared stories. And then, under the same tree where Maple and Willow were once found, Liam stood before a crowd holding a hand-painted wooden sign. Maple Hill Sanctuary, where no life is left hanging. The crowd went quiet. Thomas placed a hand on his shoulder. "Go on," he whispered. Liam took a deep breath. "I used to think broken things couldn't be fixed, that when people or animals were hurt, they stayed that way. But I was wrong, because someone cared enough not to look away." He turned to the puppies, now full-grown, tails wagging at the base of the tree. "They didn't just survive. They saved us. Me. Him." He looked at Thomas, eyes filled with gratitude. "They taught us that love isn't what you say, it's what you keep showing up for." The crowd clapped, but it wasn't just applause, it was understanding. Every person there had been changed, not just by the story, but by the reminder that redemption is real, that even the darkest roots can grow new life. Later that evening, as the stars blinked open one by one, Thomas sat with Liam on the front steps. The porch swing creaked softly beneath them. "You think they remember?" Liam asked, watching the dogs nap peacefully by the rose bushes. "I don't know," Thomas said, "but I think we do. And that's enough." Liam nodded, then added, "I used to think love meant keeping people safe, but maybe it also means letting them be strong." Thomas smiled, eyes misty. "You're already stronger than I ever was at your age." Liam leaned his head on Thomas's shoulder. "I had help," and in the silence that followed, with crickets singing and memories floating through the soft night air, Thomas felt something deep and quiet settle in his chest. Not grief, not guilt, peace, the kind that only comes when you've walked through the fire and made it out holding someone else's hand. Not every story ends with applause. Some just end with a quiet moment, like this one, where the heart finally feels full again. Maple and Willow were just 2 small lives, but their pain stirred something in a whole village. Their survival reminded a grieving man that love still had work to do, and their story gave a broken boy the courage to become someone he never thought he could be. This wasn't just a rescue. It was a reminder that kindness isn't a grand gesture. It's small hands reaching out when no one else will. It's choosing to care even when no one's watching. It's saying, "You matter," not just with words, but with time, effort, and love. There are thousands of animals out there still waiting, in the cold, in fear, in silence, and there are people like Thomas and Liam in every town, ordinary hearts with extraordinary compassion. If the story moved something inside you, don't let it stay a feeling. Turn it into action. Visit a shelter. Volunteer a weekend. Leave a bowl of water on your porch. Open your heart just an inch wider than yesterday. And if you're watching this from a different corner of the world, leave a comment below. Tell us where you're from, because this story doesn't just belong to a village. It belongs to all of us. Proof that no matter how far apart we are, love connects us in ways pain never could. Like this video, not for us, but for every forgotten animal who still believes someone is coming. Subscribe if you believe in second chances. If you believe that hope, no matter how small, is still worth planting. Because in the end, the most powerful rescue is the one that starts in the heart. Thank you for watching. And never forget, no life is too small, no soul is too broken, and no act of love is ever wasted. The Storytellers of Maple Hill. Stories like this are more than just words. They're reminders of what still matters. Love, loyalty, hope. If you felt that today, subscribe, like, and let's keep spreading what the world so desperately needs.